Good afternoon, at least on the East Coast, good afternoon. Welcome to this online public dialogue by the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life on owning slavery, pursuing justice, seeking reconciliation, lessons from Georgetown and the U.S. Jesuits. We're happy to have you with us. There are a lot of us that are on this thing, more than 2,100 people signed up to be with us. You can join the conversation on Twitter, GU Slavery Legacy, and you'll see a place on the bottom of the screen where you can send your questions. Some of you have already sent great questions. The dialogue will be recorded and shared with you if you want to share it with people who haven't been with you. This dialogue is focused on some tough realities. The Jesuits in the United States owned slaves. In 1983, the Jesuits sold 272 men, women, and children, and used some of the proceeds of that to support the university I'm a part of. We have with us two descendants of those 272 people. Sherilyn Branch, who is the retired principal of Catherine Drexel Prep, formerly Xavier University Prep, and president of the GU 272 Descendants Association, and Joseph Stewart, who had a long career with the Kellogg Foundation and is the acting president of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. In 2015, with the encouragement, the protests of some students, and the leadership of President DeGioia, Georgetown began to face up to that reality in a new way and in concrete ways. And a person who was in the middle of all that was the president's chief of staff and vice president, Joe Ferrara, and he will share some of that with us. Kim Mazik is an alumnus of Georgetown. She's not a leader at Georgetown, but she can offer us a perspective of someone who's been a part of the Georgetown community and has been watching this process. And then, as you know, as we've said, a group of descendants approached the Jesuits and Georgetown and asked for a partnership to deal with the legacy of slavery and the reality of racism today. And they reached out to Father Tim Kazicki, who is president of the Jesuit Conference in the United States. And he and Joe will talk a little bit about that process. This is not just about something that happened 100 and some years ago. This is about today. For all of us, this is personal. If I were at Georgetown right now, the building next to me is named Isaac Hawkins Hall. We know a little bit about Isaac Hawkins. He was the first name on the list that was on our promotion. He was Joe Stewart's great, 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 great grandfather. What we don't know much about is the hall used to be called Milady Hall, named after Father Thomas Milady, leader of the Jesuits who played a leading role in the sale of 272 human beings. So I'm a part of a university that has been complicit and explicitly benefited from this. That happened a long time ago and that is present today. I grew up in Minneapolis and I went home for to see my new granddaughter, Maggie Marie, and just terrific. And I went back to my old neighborhood, and 6/10 of a mile from where I grew up is where George Floyd was murdered. We grew up in the same community. We couldn't have had more different lives. And so I visited that corner and I thought, this is still a huge problem. So what I take from that is ignorance is a big problem. Indifference is really dangerous, and inaction is not an option. And so what we have today are 5 people who are working to overcome ignorance, who are helping us deal with indifference. Many of you have already moved beyond that, and are acting to try and make things better. So I would like to begin by asking each of you, right at the outset, what is the connection to what happened 138 years ago to what is going on in Minneapolis and in other communities in our country today? Let me begin with Sherilyn.
So thank you for having us, John. Obviously, 183 years ago in 1838, when this sale took place, the times of slavery influenced everything in American society, but it still does. And looking at and understanding a year ago what happened almost a year ago with George Floyd was one of the most heartbreaking experiences I have ever seen. The difference is people of color, particularly African Americans in this country, have had the collective knee on the necks of our people since we were sold here, brought here. Understanding that truth in terms of what happened with George Floyd became a vision that many of us will never forget, and felt like even more of a betrayal because we're supposed to be better. This is America, and we are not. And so George Floyd just puts a stamp on how many people have had these kinds of experiences, a betrayal not just of our justice system in terms of policing, but also a betrayal of what America indicates it stands for. And that's also in relationship to the Jesuits.
Joe Stewart, what do you think the connection is between what happened to your ancestors and what happened to George Floyd and other Black people caught in our criminal justice system?
Thank you, John. I'll just try and reinforce what Sherilyn has said so beautifully. The connection is a continuous string. It was never broken. It started then, and it's still there. It was reflected on Floyd's neck on the street. The same kind of necks that back during the era before me, the neck hung from trees. And the reality of America is that is what it has done to God's one human family. To advantage some and disadvantage others has been the history of the legacy of slavery. It started to get advantages for some. It continues to get advantage for some. And so the connection is a continuous thing. That is what slavery has done to us in this country. That's what some of us hide behind shame to not address. That's what some of us accept privileges and don't address. And so George Floyd was another symbol of those Black people who got hung from trees back in the 16th, 17th, and 1800s. And what we're trying to do, John, finally, is to address that, recognizing you're not going to change and mitigate the impact of slavery until we start dealing with the hearts of men instead of the intellectualizing and legal approach. So that's the basis of what we'll talk about later.
Thank you very much, Joe. Kim, your take, connections to what happened, benefited your university more than 180 years ago, and what happens in the communities you serve today at Catholic Charities, most obviously Minneapolis.
Sure. I mean, first of all, as an alum, you think about your university, and most people think about it in hindsight as sports competitions and those sorts of things. But I've definitely been following the stories. You know, when I first read about this in the New York Times, I was very curious. When I start relating it to contemporary history and what happened to Mr. Floyd, I think about, again, what Mr. Stewart talked about, this shame about not addressing something. It's so powerful that Georgetown decided not to turn its eye away from what occurred, 183 years ago. It had been very easy, or maybe not easy, but we know of situations where people try to uncover up things and not talk about it. To at least bring it to the forefront, to bring it to my attention, to bring it to the country's attention, the world's attention, and try to address that issue is in some ways reflective of if we turn away, then it just goes away. In the same way that I think about all those witnesses to the death of Mr. Floyd who did not turn away. Had they turned away, we would not have had that conviction.
Thank you very much. Father Kazicki, you're a Jesuit leader, you're a pastor, you're a priest. You've been involved in this process. What do you see as the connections?
In 2017, I apologized on behalf of Jesuits in the United States for the sin of Jesuit slaveholding. And that took place on your campus, but it was not a stand-alone apology. It was part of a liturgy of memory, contrition, and hope. And right before the apology, a descendant read a passage from Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And in 1845, Frederick Douglass gave this interpretation of Christianity in the United States. He wrote, "We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for churchgoers. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin throughout the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to speak for the meek and lowly Jesus." And this shows how intertwined slavery and Christianity were from the outset of this country, and how the Jesuits were morally blind and cooperated in this sin and in this evil. I believe that if we want to seriously address what happened on the streets of Minneapolis last summer continues to happen, we really need to own this history, this narrative from 1845, and see how there is a direct connection between our history as a church in the United States with the continuing sin and sickness of racism on the streets today. And until we reconcile with that, racism will endure.
Joe, Georgetown's response is not just about 180 some years ago. It's about today. What's the connection to what happened and what we see now?
Thank you, John. I would say, and I echo everything my colleagues have said so eloquently. The past is not present. The past is present. The past isn't in the past. It's here today. We see the legacies of enslavement and segregation in health disparities, in income disparities, in the policing system, in the criminal justice system. And so the murder of George Floyd, unfortunately, is a reminder of this direct link. And I would say the other point, and it relates to what we will talk about today, is that many countries, certainly our country here in the United States, but many countries have just simply not reckoned with their histories of enslavement, oppression, colonialism, and the interlocking nature of how all of those massive historical forces have not only caused oppression and pain and hardship in the past, but continue to cause it today. And so that's what we have to really reckon with. And it takes an ability to really stand up and face this history and realize that it's still very much present with us today. Thank you.
That is powerful. Let me turn back to you, Sherilyn. You are from Louisiana. You are an educator. We're a principal. You're back now working in education. You're a leader in your parish. I couldn't believe all the ministries I saw. You're president of the GU 272 Descendants. And I read something you said. You said, "My burning desire is to continue to seek justice on behalf of our GU 272 ancestors and all who have been shackled mind, body, and spirit through enslavement, and to convey our story on behalf of conveying the truth about our history." Tell us about that story. Tell us about that history. Tell us about your family. How did you come to learn this terrible history, and what was your response to it?
Well, John, just weeks before retiring from St. Catherine Drexel, I received several phone calls over a period of a few weeks from Georgetown alum Richard Cellini, who was on our board. The phone call indicated very briefly that I descended from enslaved people sold by Georgetown in 1838. Now, that's not the way the call went. He identified himself. He asked, gave me information. I knew that he was not like a telemarketer or anything like that. And the bottom line is the news was stunning. I always get goosebumps when I convey the story again, but the details of the sale were very clear. The names were clear. The ages were clear, where they were sold and who they were sold by, what plantation in Louisiana, which was Chatham Plantation. All of those details were given to me on a first call. The name of my great-grandfather, maternal great-grandfather, Basil Ford, I knew that name, but I never knew him. And so I get breathless when I even say it, because the truth, the old saying, the truth will set you free. I felt that I had been given a truth that was never shared with me before, and that it was necessary to do something with the truth.
Tell us something about your family. Who was sold? And
Yeah,
I mean, that's a terrible way to say it, but I
who
mean,
was
one
sold?
of the things is the Jesuits kept records. So as you said, you know this story.
Yes. So Basil was an infant, and his mother and father, along with 4 of his siblings, were sold in a family group to Chatham Plantation. Now, Basil being less than a year old at the time in 1838, and he had siblings age 6 to 10, that was a family unit. But clearly in 1838, he was destined to work as an enslaved person. Throughout his life, somehow he learned to read, but he reared almost 19 children. My grandmother, maternal grandmother, was one of 19. She was born on Chatham Plantation in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. I knew her well.
What lessons have you learned from that, and from your work with other descendants, and frankly, from dealing with the university and the Jesuits? What are lessons the rest of us could learn from what you've been through?
Well, we all deal with truth very differently. We are not monolithic in our thinking, in our understanding, and certainly not in our doing, what we process and what we decide to do as a result. So I did learn that. I had so much conveyed to me by that grandmother, and so much conveyed to me by my mother, who had said to me from the time this little dark-skinned girl could understand racism, that I was a descendant of slaves, that our families descended from slaves. So that was clear to me, but what wasn't as clear is what you decide to do with the truth and how you decide to respond in ways to people who may deny it. And so for me, and for just being a part of the GU 272 Descendants Association, the truth is extremely important. But one of the things that we learned even after forming the association, as a board, we were not necessarily on the same page, but democracy makes decision-making for some people difficult and for others very easy. I can clearly say that we've come to a pass where there are people who are aligned and people who are not aligned. But for me, the truth is the most important aspect in all of this.
One last quick question. You're a Catholic. You're still a Catholic. You told me a story after you heard this news of going to your pastor. How did your faith shape your response to this?
Well, first, I called everybody in my family that I had phone numbers for, but as an active parishioner, Doug Duson, my Monsignor and pastor, was also a friend and a confidant, family, not just for me. When I conveyed to him what I found out, he asked me the ultimate question, and I will never forget. He said, Sherilyn, what are you going to do about it? Now, if that wasn't calling me out, I don't know what it was, but it was also because he knew that if I knew the truth, that I would be compelled to act on it.
Thank you.
You're
Joe, you're a leader at Georgetown. You're a vice president. You're chief of staff to President DeGioia. Joe is a problem solver who don't know Georgetown. He rarely steps up, but he has been in the middle of trying to keep us safe and solvent during this pandemic. And he's been in the middle of Georgetown's response to this reality. In a certain way, you and President DeGioia got the same question that Sherilyn got from her pastor. When this came forward in a new and compelling way, the question was, what are you going to do about it? So what has Georgetown done and what are you doing about this?
Thanks, John. I would say, I would put this in the framework of acknowledgement, apology, action. And I think that's how we have looked at the work at Georgetown. There is an imperative where you have to acknowledge the history. And as Sherilyn said, not everybody faces that the same way. And that's certainly been true within the broader Georgetown community. But acknowledgement is important, and it is the first step. And that has happened in various ways at Georgetown, including some that were much lower profile, but work that took place under what was called the Jesuit Plantation Project back in the 1990s. That wasn't a university-wide effort, but there have been efforts like that over the years at Georgetown to acknowledge this history. In the last 5 years, however, what's been different has been a university-wide initiative to really start a dialogue about this and ensure that everyone in the Georgetown community is deeply aware of this history and fully engaged with it. So that's number one. Second is apology. And Tim Kazicki alluded to the apology. We felt that it was very, very important that there be a public apology. There were some people in our community who, scoffed at that and thought it was a meaningless gesture. We disagreed respectfully with that, and we thought it was a very meaningful gesture to offer a public apology. And that was on behalf of Georgetown, but also as Father Tim Kazicki offered an eloquent apology that day on behalf of the Society of Jesus. And then finally, action. And action, of course, is ongoing. What I say to people is this is not some initiative that we will declare over in a year or two. This is a permanent part of the fabric of Georgetown, and it can't be any other way. And that work will go on. And I would say, briefly, you can think of it as sort of being in various categories. One, obviously, we're a university, academic and research work. A good example of that is our Georgetown Slavery Archive, which is digitizing the archives of the university as well as the archives of the Maryland province of the Jesuits to enable us to learn more about this history. Another category is public history, making this available to people. And also memorializing this history appropriately. The best example of that, you mentioned Isaac Hawkins Hall. We rededicated 2 buildings. We renamed Milady Hall after Isaac Hawkins, and we renamed McSherry Hall after Anne Marie Beecraft, who was a free Black woman who was a religious sister. And so academic and research work, public history, and then finally, and I'll stop here because I know we're going to keep talking about this, the biggest and most important part of what Georgetown is trying to do is engagement with the descendant community. That is at the heart of this work. And that is what makes this work meaningful, important, and urgent because again, back to your earlier question, John, the descendant community and working with the descendant community, it is present. It is present now. And the urgency is now. This is not something that is somehow shrouded in the past. This is real and it is right now. So apology, acknowledgement, apology, and action has been the framework we followed at Georgetown.
That's powerful. I want to pick up the last point about the conversations with descendants. This seems to be a unique part of what Georgetown and the Jesuits are doing. Someone said what makes the Jesuits different is they keep records. And so it was possible to reach people in a way that others cannot. Those must be incredibly intense conversations and a lot of responses. You've been a part of hundreds of those meetings. What are the lessons? What are the learnings from those that the rest of us ought to pay attention to?
Well, I would say two things. One is the engagement with the descendant community at Georgetown has taken many forms. One very important form has been the process that we've been involved in supporting the descendant leaders and the Jesuit leaders in the formation of this new foundation. But it's taken a lot of forms, including our students engaging with descendants, our faculty engaging with descendants. We have descendants who have graduated from Georgetown. We have descendants who have visited Georgetown as part of pilgrimages to important sites in the history of their ancestors. And so it takes many, many different forms. And I think what I hear at the Georgetown community, and it reflects my own experience, is that every individual at the Georgetown community who has an opportunity to engage with members of the descendant community, to meet people, to develop relationships, realizes that this is among the most meaningful things that they're going to do as part of their time at Georgetown. And it helps manifest this history in the most profound way you can imagine. It's not an abstract discussion anymore when you're actually in a relationship and talking to people. And yes, some of those conversations can be intense, but it's all part of moving toward reconciliation and transformation.
The other Joe Stewart, we've already mentioned a couple times that your great-great-great-grandfather name was the first name on the bill of sale. Just talking about that is so wrong. But also is in the building next door to mine. But you have said this not about buildings. You have tried to engage. You have spent your life working with the Kellogg Foundation and Company. You have your own business. You've been a civic leader. You have Louisiana roots, but did a lot of work in Michigan. You have worked with other descendants, the Jesuits, to develop what appears to be an unprecedented effort to address and overcome the legacy of slavery and deal with the continuing reality of slavery. Why did you approach the Jesuits and others to do this? And what are you trying to accomplish?
That's a great question. I appreciate the opportunity to answer it, but I want to answer with the total perspective over what Joe has just said about Georgetown and the Jesuits, because it's very important to what we're trying to do here and go outside of the university community. The interesting thing, and Joe knows this, I care much about Georgetown. I have always spoken highly of Georgetown. On September 1 of 2016, I stood in the auditorium and said to Dr. DeGioia that Georgetown could be a marquee institution for help leading the rest of society to a different place away from this ugly history we have. But Georgetown is not the focus of what we're trying to do. The Jesuits, the focus of what we're trying to do. And regrettably, while we found out about the enslavement of our ancestors, I wish that the building wasn't named Isaac Hawkins. Had he not been a slave, it would not have been. So that's sort of a mixed emotion kind of thing. A monument does not change history. We have to act to change history. So the naming of buildings, the building of monuments on campus are not the positive ways to change society, to rid ourselves of this evil that continues to haunt God's one human family. And we can't change it with monuments. We got to change it by dealing with the roots of slavery that continues to mutate in every way you look in this country, because people are trying to hold on to the advantages and the privileges. And until we deal with those root parts of the truth, we will have misguided efforts. Georgetown, a beautiful institution, but it's about what's in Georgetown. Our movement is about what's outside of Georgetown, what's in the streets. What about the nooses that's being built in front of the Capitol, while all of the research and history is inside of Georgetown? We got to do something about the future. We got to respect and appreciate the past, but our focus has to be the future.
Joe, you have been eloquent about action and future. Others have said there are lots of responses at Georgetown and beyond. One of the most important responses, but not the only one, is this new foundation that you're the acting president of and you're working with others on. Can you just give us a couple of minutes on what that is and how you're going about that?
Yeah, Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation evolved out of a partnership that's very specifically, uniquely Jesuits and descendants. It's about a Jesuit and descendant partnership. Georgetown was very helpful in supporting the Jesuits to help us go through 3 years of convenings that led to a memorandum of understanding that led to a Descendants Truth and Reconciliation irrevocable trust. And that irrevocable trust has one sole beneficiary, and it's the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. That foundation is the instrument for investing in 3 basic objectives that's focused on changing in the future, not studying anymore the history of slavery, which we've been studying for 2 centuries. And so looking to the future, it's to support the educational aspirations of descendants for the next 100 years, to put in place a mechanism, institutionalize a response that attacks the legacy of slavery and dismantle that legacy that continues to manifest itself. You get your hands around one part of it and it pops out another part. It's popping out now in voter suppression and insurrections and all of that. We got to change that kind of way, because this democracy is crumbling under the pressure of racism and mutating legacy of slavery. We got to put it behind us. That's the bottom line goal, through truth first, reconciliation, and transformation.
Thank you. It's powerful. Father Tim, I was in Gaston Hall when you preached, and you were powerful. I looked it up today. You said the Jesuits who helped establish Georgetown University and whose leaders enslaved and mercilessly sold your ancestors stand before you and said, "We have greatly sinned. We pray with you today because we have greatly sinned and because we are profoundly sorry." You, as a leader of the Jesuits in the United States, have said apology is not enough. Acknowledgement is not enough, to use Joe's categories. Action is necessary. So Joe and other descendants come to you and say, we want a partnership to deal with this. I can imagine, you know, the Jesuits probably said, what is this going to be about? I mean, as Joe said, it wasn't Georgetown that sold the enslaved people. It was the Jesuits that they sold the people they had baptized. So you took leadership, extraordinary leadership, I think courageous leadership, and said, we're going to own this and we're going to act together. Why and how did you get the Jesuits to commit to owning this and acting on it? And then after that, I want to ask you, what are some of the lessons you've learned for the rest of the church?
Thank you for your comments and this question, John. In January of this year, actually, Ms. Cheryl Branch and I were on a panel for National Day of Racial Healing. And one of the panelists, I'm sure she'll remember this, said that there are three truths. There's my truth, your truth, and the true truth. What is the real truth? And for hundreds of years, Jesuits have known this history. It's been written, it's been published, it's been read, it's been taught, but it's all been, for lack of a better word, my truth or our truth. And it all changed in 2016 when, through the work of the Georgetown Memory Project and others, we came face to face with descendants of Jesuit slaveholding. Now you can see, if you look at that, now our truth met the truth of Ms. Cheryl Branch, the truth of Mr. Joseph Stewart, and so many others. And suddenly we didn't know the whole story. We didn't know the true truth. And that's where we are heading. This is the important journey we are on. What was remarkable was, after many conversations and encounters, that these descendant leaders invited us into a partnership. And we did a very formal dialogue process sponsored by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in their framework of truth, racial healing, and transformation, in which there was a lot of raw truth-telling and tears, absorbing the pain and the shame of this history and the fear of moving forward, broken by the faith of the people on this call who said, let's move forward. Let's not beat you up because of your past, but we will beat you up if you don't commit yourself to changing the future. And so that is transformation. That is reconciliation. That is, in this Easter season, what new life looks like. And I think it was that desire for the truth, as God sees the truth, that has brought us to this moment.
What are some lessons for the rest of the church? While this is in some ways about the Jesuits, the entire church is complicit in this. What have you learned? What do people need to know? What do people need to forget or stop doing in order to actually engage?
We have to embrace this history. When I listen to the detractors, the people who say this is an event in the past, this is something that I individually am not responsible for, we have to understand that the legacy of slavery continues. I remember hearing Brian Stevenson speak here in Washington. Many of you may know his book, Just Mercy, his work with the Equal Justice Initiative. And he was speaking to a bunch of students of Jesuit institutions. And he said, you have to realize that in 1865, slavery did not end, it evolved. And this is the work that the Catholic Church in the United States has to engage in, because we are part of this history. The beauty of the vision of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation is it's not another institution in the traditional sense. It's not another church building or a school. As the descendant leader said to me, you've invested in institutions, buildings. We want you now to invest in people, but invest in people in a way that is transformative and a bold investment. That's why they're calling for $1 billion foundation, because it shows a bold commitment to seriously tackle racism and invite people into racial healing. And the one thing, as hard as this dialogue process has been, no one here has ever made me feel ashamed of this past. They've accompanied me in the pain of understanding it. and then invited me, and I think invited the Jesuits and invite the Catholic Church to say, now let's step up and respond to it.
Kim, I've admired your work for a long time at Catholic Relief Services, the work you do in outreach and advocacy at Catholic Charities USA. You're a remarkable leader, but you're not a Jesuit, obviously. You're not the chief of staff at Georgetown. You're not a descendant. You're not a direct descendant. You are not involved in this process. In some ways, you're like us, sort of listening and learning from this. But the thing I want to ask you is, this is not just about what the Jesuits do or descendants do or Georgetown. This is what our nation does. And this requires not only a new foundation, some new actions by Jesuits, this requires different policies, different priorities, a different kind of national leadership. How does your work as an educator and advocate, applying the principles of Catholic social teaching, inform this task of dealing with slavery and continuing racism?
Sure. So first of all, John, what I'd like to say is Sherilyn and Father Tim both talked about truth and embracing it. So in all of this work, that's how we have to do it, especially as we address racism. I've had many conversations where I will say something and someone will say, did that really happen? But I think we have to listen to the truth. We have to embrace it. And we have to think about what the gospel call is. Two things that I want to mention is when we think about this truth and we think about moving forward as opposed to looking past, it's much like the gospel story of the Good Samaritan. We can focus on who beat this man up that's at the side of the road, or we could do what the Good Samaritan does, picks him up, takes care of him, and knows that we are moving it forward. And I think Georgetown's trying to do that with the Descendant Project, but also recently, the Georgetown Prison and Justice Initiative, engaging people who are incarcerated to get degrees, because that can make a difference when they are able to return home. I look forward to sharing my degree with others in that situation. That tells me that Georgetown is looking forward. When we think about this work in terms of the church, in terms of institutions and policies, again, we have to listen and we have to move forward. We have to figure out ways to think about, how do we talk about these things? How do we build awareness? If we don't do that, then we're still focusing too much on what happened in the past. As again, the Good Samaritan. I mean, we never hear about who beat this man up. We only hear about the story about the man who came and took care of him. We have to be those people. And we have to encourage that in each other, both in church, both in our government, and in our institutions. A college campus is the perfect place for that work to begin.
Everything we know about the pandemic is that its effects were disproportionate, affecting African-American Latinos more than others. We now see in our nation efforts at voter suppression. Every measure of life shows the impact of racism as a nation. What are the kind of policies that Charities works for, others work for, that can in fact bring greater racial justice, bring greater economic justice?
Sure. So I'll first talk about some of the things impacting people living in poverty, which we know has been created by these disparities. We all heard the story about 40 acres and a mule, and we also know that really didn't occur for many people who were enslaved. Much like Sherilyn and Mr. Stewart, my story may not be descendants of Georgetown people who were enslaved, but I wear these earrings as people who were enslaved. My people are from South Carolina. But as we think about moving forward, how do we address the injustices to farmers? The Department of Agriculture is trying to do that, but how do we make sure that we look at programs that have been established to help people, whether that's obtain housing? How do we make sure that there are fair housing laws? How do we make sure that people are able to access food and nutritious food? That programs like SNAP, which we don't expect people to be on for a lifetime, but they actually address people's needs. But this isn't just about poverty. How do we make sure that we see justice across the board, so that when we talk about hiring practices and how we build community, that we see it across the board, so that we don't also continue to only see people in the lens of, if you're a person of color, that must be you're impoverished. That's also an easy signal to go to, where how do we open up universities to create better opportunities for people to get degrees and then move forward and be able to be self-sustaining as opposed to relying.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We have tons of questions. We have questions about the Catholic Church and racism, Catholic bishops. We have questions about reconciliation, the role of forgiveness in this. We have questions about what young Jesuits ought to do, but we also have some questions, more general questions about what is done and what's being done. Some people are really excited about it, think Georgetown and the Jesuits are blazing a trail, finally some action. Other people dismiss it, frankly. I've heard my folks came from Ireland. I had nothing to do with slavery. My folks were treated terribly. Why is Georgetown paying special attention to this? Others say this is way too small. You know, what was done was so horrific that this is not adequate. Others say this isn't my idea. I haven't been involved in this. There are lots of voices. There are lots of groups. Joe Ferrara, let me turn to you. People feel very strongly about this at every level. How does President DeGioia, how does the university deal with people who say that this is not my thing? This is not my way. I've not been involved enough. I have a different idea. How do you respond to that?
Well, thank you, John. I would say two things. One is, it is about all of us. So the transformation that Joe Stewart talked about earlier, the path of truth-telling, reconciliation, healing, and transformation, it has to occur at a personal level. So literally at the level of each of us on our own journey of understanding our common humanity. But it also, for a place like Georgetown, what we say to people is it also has to happen at the institutional level. But it's both, meaning if the institution is doing something and you're sitting on the sidelines, that's not really full transformation, and vice versa. If you're doing something in your personal life and your personal actions, that's great, but if the institution's doing nothing, that's also not full transformation. So that's one response. The other thing I would say is we are dealing with a massive historical legacy of pain, oppression, killings. If you immerse yourself in this history, there's no way you don't come out of it numb and horrified. And you have to find a way to move forward. How can we move forward positively and not let that terrible legacy paralyze us into inaction? And I think all of us on this call, we have faced moments like that, it seems so daunting to find a way to navigate a way forward. And yet you must find a way forward. And I think we have all been driven by that urgency.
Do others want to respond? This is not my problem. It's not adequate. I've not been adequately involved. It's not my idea. What is Georgetown going to do about the student referendum? I mean, this takes many forms. How do you respond to people who say, I've got an idea and this isn't my idea?
I will respond, and I want to tie into what Joe said and what Kimberly said. And it's just one simple concept. We can stand around and argue for another 200 years, or we can act. And that's all we have done. We have acted. And we've tried to take a different pathway from the confrontation and arguing to see if we can get someplace. And at this point, we have started to move someplace we've never been. And act by being involved. Act by understanding what the truth is. Act by being committed. I know this is a gathering of Catholics. If you can say the Apostles' Creed, then you cannot be satisfied with what is happening in God's one human family. It's impossible. And I will boldly say, without attempting to insult anybody, you say the Apostle Creed and be satisfied with the conditions of God's one human family, and you're lying to God. You cannot say, I believe, and do nothing about it. It's time to get up out of those pews. And I want to go back and say one other thing. Catholicism is as guilty as the Jesuits are to the legacy of slavery. It just so happened that the Archbishop of Baltimore got the first money from the sale of our ancestors. That wasn't the Jesuits, it was the Catholic Church. Carolyn and I, from the time Mom could take us in our arms to a pew in the Catholic Church, Carolyn may not have, I've never asked her this, we had to go in the Catholic Church and sit in the black pews.
Yes.
We had been baptized by the Jesuits to be Catholic, and we'd held on to that. I am waiting until this day to go to Mass on Sunday morning and hear one priest get up and take issue with racism and the conditions that racism is causing in the one human family. And I don't attack the priest for that. I say, let's prove we're Catholic if we're Catholic. Because if not, a lot of us, probably include myself, gonna have a hard time facing God if we believe in him. We're gonna have a hard time. And we gotta make a decision now. Are we gonna act or are we gonna argue?
Let's continue with that thing. You know how to preach. You may not be a priest and you may not be tough on preachers, but you know how to preach. One person asked, I'm trying to find it, says, is there something within Catholicism, the big tent, the get along, go along kind of culture that keeps us from dealing with this directly? Another one asks, what responsibility do our bishops have to speak out more clearly against racism and Christian nationalism? And then one for you, Father Tim, what advice would you give to young Jesuits who want to do more to help and create awareness within and beyond the Society of Jesus? So is there something in our church that keeps us from acknowledging the truth? Secondly, what can young Jesuits do and what can the bishops do? Maybe Sherilyn and Kim and then Father Tim. And then we're going to have to, I'll try and do one more before we have to wrap up.
So I'll make this as brief as I can. Within our church, there's been always hate, racism, and ignorance. And there was always this top-down understanding of what, as Catholics, of what has not really evolved. I think many priests or bishops or parishes are afraid of going against the grain because it affects the collection plate. And so unfortunately, it has caused us to have more victimization and a denial of the truth. And unfortunately, that continues in our church. For me, I happen to attend a predominantly Black church. And so we do talk about racial issues. We do center around social justice in our work, in our ministries. But I have to say this as a caveat, slavery didn't start and end with the Jesuits. It is an institutional understanding that undergirds everything in the United States, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's housing, healthcare, and other ways that we discriminate in education. And so the Jesuits don't own it. The United States owns it.
Kim, how about the rest of the church? The bishops, lead organizations like Catholic Charities, CRS, you were a part of. What are our responsibilities?
Sure. Much like what Sherilyn just said, I mean, I think there's fear, but there's a clear responsibility emboldened within our Catholic social teaching. You can't talk about it. And Mr. Stewart talked a lot about this one human family. We talk about, the human life and dignity of person. We are a pro-life church. You can't be pro-life if you won't speak out on racism. You can't abandon one and claim to be the other. And so there's a huge responsibility. I think the social justice agencies like CRS, like Catholic Charities USA, are pushing forward that work, but we need constant support from all the priests and all the bishops across the country.
Thank you.
Father Tim, a real quick comment on what young Jesuits can do.
Yes, in our many young Jesuits would know that when Father Rupe was general during our 32nd general congregation, we came up with this the mantra of faith that does justice. And there's a very powerful quote from the 70s, which was reiterated by Pope Benedict in 2008. And it says that wherever in the church there has been a crisis, whether it's at the crossroads of ideologies, in the social trenches, where the burning exigencies of the time met the perennial message of the gospel, there Jesuits have been. And that's what we are called to do, because the sin of racism is the crossroads between the exigencies of the time and the message of the gospel. And we have to address it in a very pastoral, evangelical, and prophetic way.
I see by the clock behind Cheryl that we're almost there. I'm going to throw you a curveball. I was going to ask you at the very end to give us that are watching this one thing that we could do if we want to make things better, and you can give that. The other questions are about language. We hear about justice. We hear about reparation. We hear about reconciliation. We hear about forgiveness. If you could offer some insight into how those words apply in a situation like this, and then maybe close with a really quick suggestion. So the language, reparation, justice, reconciliation, forgiveness, and what people can do to make things better. Why don't we begin with Father Tim?
Well, I think reconciliation and transformation are essential. Reconciliation requires action, and transformation requires investment and commitment. And I believe I'm giving my life to this Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, because it is action forward at addressing the sin of racism.
Kim?
So when I think of those three words, what I initially was drawn to is repairing, to make people whole. And that's how policy will work. That's how these projects will work. We have to be committed to making people whole. And for some people, that's going to be addressing social needs, but justice for all of us means that we make all of us whole. We prepare trauma that has occurred. And we can't just think that the trauma has happened to people of color. White people have to know that enslavement and racism creates trauma in their lives that may just not be unearthed or discussed.
Joe Stewart.
I'll use one word that is so critical to dealing with the truths and beginning to heal. And the word that should cover all of that is we got to learn to love and stop talking about it. If we don't learn that the heart is the answer to this, and love has to be in the heart, then we can continue to argue, and we argue about a lack of truth. The argument's about not facing the truth.
The other Joe.
I think what Kimberly and Joe just said is exactly right on. It is about repair, and it's about love. And if we can be guided by what is in our hearts and by the natural feeling of love that we have, that will guide us along the right path. I know it will. And we have to act. And I think that's another part of this. We have to act on the feelings of love. And that will guide us. And I have great faith in that. I really do.
Sherilyn.
This is an opportunity for all of us to collectively come to an understanding. We came to a table At times we argued, at times we didn't believe each other, at times we didn't believe in each other. But one of the things that happened in this process is that we decided not to leave. We decided to commit. Healing racism may seem like something impossible, but we are still in the evolution of slavery. And so if we don't put that first, along with the truth, and reconcile the hate that we know exists in the country we live in, then it will continue. It is not going to stop. It will not stop unless we do something about it collectively.
Sherilyn, I am still haunted by the question your pastor asked you, what are you going to do about it? I think that's the question for the couple thousand people on
Yes.
this call. And I go back at the beginning that ignorance is no excuse, indifference is dangerous, and inaction is not an option. This has been a remarkable conversation. It is really good to find people, and there are always things that can be done better and all the rest. It's great to see people that are stepping up and stepping forward in the face of terrible wrong to try and make things right. I want to just close by a couple coming attraction. Another issue, a compelling issue, involves racism. We're doing a Salt and Light and Latino Leader Gathering on Tuesday, May 4th, next Tuesday, on young and Latino leaders on immigration, continuing challenges, new urgency, time for action. Sister Norma Pimentel, the Pope's favorite nun, right on the border. Dylan Corbett, also working on the border. Anna Chavarin from Tucson, and Jessica Hernandez from Des Moines. Young leaders are going to talk about how to make a difference there. I want to thank everybody who joined us. I especially want to thank the two Joes, Kim, Sherilyn, and Father Tim. And I want to especially single out a friend. Amy, our friend at the Berkeley Center, stepped up in a really special way. Anna Misla, who always pulls all this stuff together with Kim and I. Anna got married on Saturday, which I think was very thoughtless of her, since we had this very important discussion coming. But Amy and Kim and others stepped up, Joe and his team. I think in the middle of a racial reckoning, having a conversation like this about how we can right wrongs and make things better is exactly what we need to hear today. So I'm grateful for you for joining us, and I'm especially grateful to our panelists, not just for what they said today, but for what they're doing every day. Thank you very much.